Welcome to the Velvet Myth. I'm your host, Adam, and I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this quiet moment with me. As you settle in and begin to drift toward sleep, I hope this story arrives just as all the best things do. Softly, gently, and exactly when it's needed most. It was created with great care, and my sincerest wish is that it brings you comfort, calm, and restful sleep tonight. And if, by morning, you find yourself feeling a little lighter, a little more refreshed, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Knowing that you are here, sharing this moment with me, even through a few simple words, means more than I can say. But that's for tomorrow. Right now, there's nothing to do and nowhere to be. So let yourself settle. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Loosen your hands. And allow your whole body to feel the weight of the bed beneath you. Take one slow breath in and let it go. And one more, breathing in ease and releasing whatever the day left behind. You don't need to stay awake for any of this. Simply listen for as long as feels right and drift off the moment you're ready. There's no wrong way to do this. Now close your eyes and let the story begin. The door was heavier than you expected, and it swung open slowly, letting in a brief gust of damp autumn air before you stepped through and let it fall shut behind you. Outside, the rain had been steady for the better part of an hour. Not dramatic, not storming, just a soft, persistent tapping against everything. And your jacket had caught the edges of it on the walk from the bus stop. You paused in the entryway and gave your shoulders a small shake, sending a few drops onto the mat beneath your feet. Then you were still, and the museum settled around you. The lobby was amber lit and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like a room that has been carefully kept that way for a long time. The ceiling arched overhead in a pale stone vault, and the light came from fixtures set low and warm along the walls, casting long, gentle shadows across the marble floor. There was no music, no announcements, just the faint, almost subliminal hum of the building's heating, working steadily somewhere out of sight. And the smell, old wood, polished stone, something faintly mineral, like the inside of a very old book, or a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. It was, without question, the right place to be on a Tuesday evening in late September. A young woman at the front desk looked up and offered a quiet smile, sliding a folded paper brochure across the counter without being asked. You took it and opened it loosely in your hands. A small map of the galleries, text in a font slightly too small to bother reading in this light, and then folded it again and tucked it under your arm. It felt good, just to hold something. Harold was standing near the archway that led into the first corridor, consulting his watch with the patient attention of someone who had checked it many times this evening. Harold was a small, neatly composed man in his late 60s, wearing a pressed navy blazer with a museum badge pinned just below the left lapel. His silver-white hair was combed carefully to one side, and his wire-rimmed glasses caught the amber light as he looked up. He adjusted them once with 2 fingers, then smiled. Good, Harold said softly. That should be everyone then. His voice had the quality of one who had long ago stopped the need to project it. Another lady by the name of Margot was already beside him, her long green cardigan falling almost to her knees, a worn canvas tote bag looped over one wrist with a library logo nearly faded to nothing. Margot glanced over and gave a small, unhurried nod. Not quite a full greeting, but warm in the way that the lobby was warm, quiet and meaning it. Harold clasped his hands together loosely. We'll keep things easy tonight, he said, not quite to either of you in particular. There's no rush. We'll take a slow turn through the main galleries, the natural history rooms, the paintings, a few other things. He paused, as though briefly remembering something, then let it go. Closing isn't until 9. The three of you turned, almost without deciding to, and began walking down the marble corridor. Rain tapped at the tall, arched windows along the left wall, steady and soft, and Harold's brown shoes gave a small, gentle squeak with every other step. The fossil hall opened around you gradually, the way a room does when the lights are kept low on purpose. Harold led you both through a wide doorway and into a long gallery where amber-lit cases lined either wall, their glass fronts glowing faintly against the surrounding dark. The ceiling here was high, and the air carried a different quality than the lobby. Older, somehow, faintly mineral, like the smell of a stone that has been left undisturbed for a long time. Your footsteps changed as you entered. The marble was smoother here, and the sound of each step lifted and spread before settling again into silence. Harold's shoes gave their small squeak at every other step, and the rhythm of it was almost metronomic, almost soothing. Harold slowed beside a long central case without any particular announcement. Inside, arranged on pale cloth, lay a series of ammonites, their spiral shapes coiled and precise, alongside flat slabs of dark stone where the outlines of ancient ferns had been pressed like signatures. Harold looked at them for a moment before speaking in the same unhurried way he seemed to do most things. During the day, the school groups come through here, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to fill the space without disturbing it. 40 children in this room at once, 42 sometimes. He smiled at the case rather than at either of you. It's a different room entirely, a good kind of different. But this, he let the sentence finish itself with a small gesture toward the quiet. This is something else. Harold moved then to the next case along the wall, consulting the small card in his hand. He began to describe something about a marine specimen, the depth at which it was found, the approximate age, and was about 2 sentences in when he stopped. He looked at the card, then at the case, then gave a soft, unbothered sound, somewhere between a laugh and a clearing of the throat. "I've started with the wrong one," he said simply. "I do this occasionally." He took a small step back and found the proper case, one closer to the doorway, the one that actually corresponded to his card, and resumed in exactly the same calm tone as though nothing had interrupted him at all. There was something deeply comfortable about the way he handled it, without apology or embarrassment, just a small course correction, and then onward. Margot had not followed Harold to the wrong case. She had drifted, quietly, to a small display set into a recessed shelf along the far wall, the kind of thing that sat below eye level and asked to be overlooked. She was standing very still, with her head tilted slightly, studying something inside. When you moved closer, you could see what had caught her attention. A trilobite, small enough to fit in a palm, its segmented ridges still intact and extraordinarily neat, each curve preserved with an almost architectural precision. "Look at the shape of it," Margot said, not loudly. It wasn't quite an invitation, and wasn't quite a statement. It was the sort of thing someone says when they're mostly speaking to themselves, but don't mind company. Harold came to stand beside her. The three of you were quiet for a moment, looking at the delicate pattern pressed into the stone. Something 400 million years old, sitting under a small light, asking nothing of any of you except to be noticed. The rain continued outside, steady and unhurried, the same as it had been all evening. Harold led you out of the fossil hall and into a longer corridor, his brown shoes marking a soft, rhythmic squeak against the marble. The corridor opened, almost without announcement, into the painting gallery, a wide, unhurried room with muted grey-green walls and a row of landscape paintings hung at even intervals beneath ceiling lights that cast everything in the same low amber as the rest of the museum. The room smelled faintly of linseed oil and something older underneath it, a dry, papery warmth that seemed to belong to the walls themselves. At the far end, 2 tall, arched windows looked out onto the street, and you could see the rain had thickened since you'd come inside. It moved down the glass in shifting curtains now, and the amber glow of a street lamp outside caught the water and held it briefly before it disappeared. The sound of it reached you clearly here, a steady, layered hiss that was somehow both louder and more soothing than it had been in the fossil hall, where the stone and the cases had muffled it down to almost nothing. Harold drifted toward a painting near the middle of the wall, a wide horizontal canvas depicting a river at dusk, the water painted in flat greys and deep blues, a tree line low on the horizon, and above it a sky that occupied most of the space. Harold stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back and tilted his head in a way that suggested the painting was an old acquaintance. "People always say, 'This one feels cold,'" Harold said. He didn't say it like a prepared remark. He said it the way you'd mention something you'd noticed over years of standing in the same spot. Even in July, even when the building is quite warm, they'll stand in front of it and mention that they feel a chill. He paused. "I can't explain it. I've never felt cold looking at it myself, but I believe them." You looked at the painting. The river did have a certain stillness to it, that flat, unreflective quality of water in the gray hour between afternoon and dark. Margot had moved on already, drawn toward a smaller canvas hung near the window at the end of the room. You followed slowly, staying several paces back. The painting she'd chosen was quieter than the river scene, a gentle countryside, fields of muted yellow-green, a farmhouse barely visible in the background, and running through the lower portion of the canvas, a road that led toward the edge of the frame and simply stopped. "I like the empty road," Margot said, not turning around. She adjusted the strap of her canvas tote and remained there for a while, looking. The three of you moved on through the rest of the room without any particular plan, pausing where something held your attention and passing others by without apology. Harold offered a word or two about a few of the canvases, the name of a painter, a detail about where a scene had supposedly been observed, but mostly the room did its own quiet work, and Harold seemed content to let it. At some point, Harold gestured toward a long wooden bench positioned in the center of the gallery, worn smooth at the seat and slightly uneven on its legs. "There's no rule against sitting," Harold said pleasantly. The three of you settled onto the bench, and for a while no one said anything. The rain pressed its sound against the windows. Somewhere in the building, the heating system exhaled a long, low note. You rested your jacket across your lap and let your shoulders drop. And the room held you all in its amber light, still and unhurried, asking nothing. Harold rose from the bench first, straightening his blazer with a small adjustment at the lapel, and led the two of you back out through the painting gallery and down a side corridor you hadn't come through before. The hallway was narrow and cool, lined with framed informational panels that no one stopped to read, and it opened after a few turns into a room that felt altogether different from the ones before it. The mineral hall was smaller and lower ceilinged, its walls lined on three sides with long glass display cases lit from within. The light inside each case was warm and directed, falling across trays of polished stones in a way that made the rest of the room feel dim by comparison. Margot had stopped beside you without your noticing, and the two of you stood there for a moment, in easy silence, not saying anything, not needing to. Then, at the far end of the row, one of the case lights flickered. It lasted less than a second, a brief dimming, a faint waver, and then the light steadied again, as if nothing had happened. It was the only small disruption of the entire evening, and it barely qualified as one. Harold glanced toward it with a mild, unhurried expression, the look of someone who has seen a thing happen many times and finds it more familiar than surprising. "The lights do that," Harold said, nodding once. "Labels peel in winter too. Little things. The building has its own habits after hours." Harold turned back toward the cases, and for a moment his gaze drifted in the way it sometimes did, settling somewhere between the present room and somewhere else. Then he said, almost to himself as much as to either of you, that the flickering reminded him of something that had happened years ago. There had been a small artifact, Harold explained. Nothing especially significant, a fragment of carved stone from a mid-century collection that had been considered missing for several days, a quiet concern, the kind that generated careful handwritten notes and a good deal of checking of shelves. And then it turned up, Harold said, exactly where no one had thought to look first. Placed neatly on the wrong cleaning cart, moved one room over, sitting in plain sight on a shelf in the storage corridor the whole time. Margot smiled at that, a small and genuine smile, the kind that didn't need anything added to it. Harold smiled too, and then the three of you continued down the row, past the quiet stones, past the steady glow of the cases, deeper into the soft amber dark of the room. The corner gallery arrived quietly, the way the end of a good evening tends to, not announced, just present. Harold turned left at the end of the mineral hall and led you both down a short corridor where the ceiling lowered slightly and the flooring changed from stone to carpet. The sound of the museum fell away behind you. Here, fabric absorbed what marble had reflected, and the room felt smaller, warmer, more like a room someone actually lived in. The textiles hung in shallow display frames along the walls or lay flat beneath glass on low tables. Woven pieces in muted ochres and deep blues, embroidered panels in careful geometric patterns, cloth that had once been useful and was now preserved. Small spotlights cast warm pools of amber across the surfaces, barely enough to read by, just enough to see. Harold clasped his hands behind his back and spoke more quietly than he had all evening. The tour had been winding down inside him for some time, you sensed, and this room seemed to suit that, a place for softer voices. He mentioned that visitors often moved through this section quickly. There were no dinosaurs here, no dramatic stones that caught the light, just cloth and thread and the long, unhurried work of human hands. But Harold said, in that gentle and slightly trailing way of his, that this was one of the rooms that rewarded patience, if you gave it any. He leaned forward toward one of the labels on the wall, squinting briefly behind his round glasses, then straightened again. He didn't need the whole card. He remembered the date, late 19th century, a regional weaving tradition, and mentioned it simply, the way you'd mention something you'd thought about often enough that it had become comfortable. Margot had already moved slightly ahead of you both. Harold kept talking softly about the way repeated patterns could carry information across generations, how cloth was a kind of record. But Margot had stopped in front of one of the low glass tables, her attention fixed on something at the edge of a large folded textile. She tilted her head. Then she pointed, not to draw a crowd, just to share what she'd noticed. A section along the hem where the fabric had been carefully mended. The repair was not hidden. You could see where different thread had been used, slightly off in colour, stitched with the same care as the original, but clearly added later, by different hands, at a different time. Margot said she always liked that. Evidence that something useful had been repaired rather than discarded. Harold nodded, looking at the mended edge with the same quiet attention he'd given everything else all evening. You stood, a little further down the row, before a wide panel of faded cloth in a pattern of repeated diamonds, each one built from dozens of small, even stitches. There was a rhythm to it, steady and unhurried, the kind of rhythm that took weeks or months to produce. You found yourself following one row of stitches with your eyes, without meaning to, moving across the cloth slowly, the way you might follow rain down a window. Harold checked his watch. He did it without interrupting anything, glancing at his wrist and then looking back at the room. He said, in a voice just above a murmur, that they ought to start making their way toward the front. The museum would be closing soon. The gift shop was small and a little dim, the way gift shop corners in museums tend to be after hours. Shelves of postcards and keychains and small reproductions sitting quietly in the low light, not waiting to be bought, just resting there. A revolving rack of bookmarks near the entrance had stopped spinning, and a stack of folded paper brochures sat at the edge of the counter, slightly askew. Harold noticed the brochures immediately. Without pausing, without making any particular announcement about it, he stepped behind the counter and straightened the stack with both hands, pressing the edges together until they lined up neatly. It was a small, habitual gesture, the kind a person makes, after 11 years, in the same building, tending to the same corners, without being asked. He looked up and smiled at you both. He said it had been a very good tour this evening, and he meant it in the way that people mean things when they are not trying to impress anyone. He thanked you for your patience with the slow pace, and said, with a slight duck of his chin, that he knew it was not always the most thrilling way to spend a Tuesday night. Margot made a soft sound that was nearly a laugh. She said there was nowhere she would rather have been, and the simplicity with which she said it made it sound entirely true. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag up onto her shoulder, smoothing the faded canvas strap with her thumb, and wished you a quiet good evening. Harold told you both to take care in the rain, and he gave a small, final nod, the kind that closes an evening without making any fuss about it. His glasses caught the light for a moment as he turned to set a few things in order behind the counter. You pulled on your jacket. It was still slightly damp at the collar from the walk-in a few hours earlier, when the evening had not yet begun. You moved toward the glass doors at the entrance, and Margot was just ahead of you, already pushing gently through. The night air met you at the threshold, cooler than the museum, fresh with rain. The street outside was wet and dark and quietly lit by the amber blur of a nearby lamp, and the rain was still falling in the same patient, even way it had been all evening, as if it had never felt any urgency about stopping. You heard the soft click of the museum door closing behind you. Harold would lock it now and move through the galleries one last time, checking that every light was off, every case was sealed. The building would settle into its nighttime quiet. The fossils and the paintings and the stones and the stitched cloth, all resting in the dark, exactly where they had been left. You walked, not quickly. The rain fell on your jacket and on the pavement ahead of you, and you carried the evening with you, all of its stillness, all of its smallness, and it was, without question, enough.